It is the spring of 1713, and a privateer captain is standing on the deck of his sloop somewhere in the waters off Hispaniola. He has a letter of marque in his sea chest, a formal document issued under the English crown, authorizing him to attack, capture, and plunder enemy shipping during the War of Spanish Succession. For the past several years, that piece of paper has been the difference between a lawful maritime raider and a criminal who hangs from a waterfront gibbet. Now someone has rowed out from a passing merchant vessel and handed him a dispatch. The war is over. The Treaty of Utrecht has been signed. England and Spain are no longer enemies. England and France are no longer enemies either. After more than a decade of brutal Atlantic conflict, the major powers of Europe have agreed to stop fighting. His commission is now worthless paper. He has 60 armed men aboard that sloop. They signed articles before the voyage, agreeing to fight for shares of prize money taken from enemy vessels. They have not received significant payment in weeks. They are not Royal Navy sailors drawing a guaranteed wage. They are privateers, and privateers only earn money when they take a ship. Now, legally, they cannot take any ship at all. Nobody is going to absorb this crew into a peacetime navy. There is no pension waiting in port. No colonial governor is preparing to hand civilian work to 60 men whose only real expertise is how to board an armed vessel, overpower its crew, and strip everything valuable from the hold. The skills these men spent years developing are now, technically, illegal to use. This is exactly the moment the popular version of pirate history skips over. The romantic story gives you men who chose crime from the beginning, outlaws by nature, rebels who raised the black flag because they loved freedom and hated authority. That version is satisfying, and it sells movie tickets, but it cannot explain one of the most striking patterns in the Atlantic historical record. Piracy did not hold at a steady level across the early 1700s. What you see in colonial dispatches, admiralty records, and insurance claims is a controlled level of Atlantic raiding during the war years, followed by a dramatic surge in piracy starting around 1713 and lasting through roughly 1726. That surge does not come from nowhere. It follows the employment curve of the privateering economy almost exactly. When the commissions expired, the raids did not stop. They just lost their legal justification. Welcome to Dead Man's Shore. I am Jack, and this channel is where we dig into the real history behind the pirate world, the parts that survive in court records and colonial dispatches rather than in films and folklore. If you are new here, subscribe and leave a comment below, because there is a question coming up in this video that I genuinely want your answer to. Now let us get back to that captain and to the problem that made the Golden Age of Piracy possible in the first place. To understand what collapsed in 1713, you have to understand what privateering actually was, because it was not simply legal piracy with better paperwork, even though the methods looked nearly identical from a distance. A privateer was a privately owned armed vessel operating under a formal government authorization to attack enemy shipping during wartime. That authorization came in the form of a letter of marque and reprisal, issued by a monarch, a colonial governor acting under delegated royal authority, or a designated admiralty official. The document named which national flags could be legally targeted, sometimes defined a geographic zone of operation, and gave the holder standing in a prize court, which was the government tribunal that processed captured vessels and determined what was done with them. Without a valid letter of marque, you were a pirate. With one, you were a privateer. The behavior on the water could be nearly identical. The critical difference was the paperwork and the political relationship between the attacker's flag and the victim's flag. The prize court was the machine that converted maritime violence into legitimate commercial profit. When a privateer took an enemy vessel, he brought the prize into a port with an active court, submitted it for adjudication, and waited for the court to confirm the capture was legal. If it was, the proceeds moved through a defined formula. A share went to the Crown or the colonial government. A share went to the investors who had funded the voyage. The rest was divided among the captain and crew according to the articles they had signed before departure, with amounts based on rank and role. Everything was documented. Every transaction had a paper trail. The whole enterprise was woven into the legitimate colonial economy in a way that made the boundary between respectable commerce and maritime violence genuinely difficult to see clearly from the inside. A merchant who bought legally condemned prize cargo through the court system was operating in the same social world as the captain who took the prize and the governor who signed the commission. During the War of Spanish Succession, the scale of Atlantic privateering was enormous. Historians working from port records and prize court registers have identified hundreds of active English commissions across the Caribbean and American coast at various points during the conflict. And that does not count the parallel operations run by France and Spain against Allied shipping. Nassau, on New Providence Island in the Bahamas, was one of the most active privateering bases in the Caribbean theater. Port Royal in Jamaica processed prize vessels regularly. Several ports along the American colonial coast issued commissions and ran prize proceedings at different stages of the war. The entire Atlantic had become a theater of licensed raiding, sustained by legal machinery that depended on wars to function. When the wars stopped, the machinery had no purpose. The men trained to operate it were still very much alive and very much armed. The Treaty of Utrecht did not just invalidate the commissions, it also triggered a significant demobilization of the Royal Navy. Naval crews were paid off and discharged across the fleet. The Atlantic maritime labor pool was flooded simultaneously from two directions. Former privateers were losing their commissions at exactly the same moment as former naval men were being put ashore with limited prospects. Merchant shipping was growing, which created some demand for experienced sailors, but it could not absorb this volume of men quickly, and it could not absorb them at anything approaching the income they had been earning under prize shares. A sailor on a merchant vessel earned a fixed wage that was low, irregular, and subject to deductions before it reached his hands. The work was physically brutal. The power balance aboard a merchant ship left ordinary sailors with almost no recourse against abusive captains, and the pay offered no stake in the outcome. The shift from privateer prize shares back to merchant wages was not a modest adjustment. It was a return to a system that offered less protection, less income, and no compensation for the risk of violence. For men who had spent years working on shares and taking prizes, this was the kind of change that people find reasons to resist. Here is where the myth starts falling apart completely. The men who moved into piracy after Utrecht were not primarily motivated by a love of freedom or a hatred of civilization. They were motivated by something far more familiar. They had specific skills. Those skills had market value only in a maritime raiding economy. The legal version of that economy had just closed. They knew how to handle armed vessels, read coastlines, manage prize crews, identify valuable cargo, and run the logistical side of an extended voyage at sea. Those skills had almost no application in the peacetime colonial labor market at the income level that privateers had become accustomed to. The temptation to keep doing what they had been doing, just without the commission, was the direct and predictable consequence of having built an entire professional identity around an economy that the government had switched off without providing any alternative. For several years after Utrecht, the enforcement gap was wide enough that the risk of piracy was manageable for men willing to calculate it. The Royal Navy was reducing its Atlantic presence as part of the post-war drawdown. Colonial governors in the Caribbean had divided interests. Some were invested in the informal trade that piracy generated. Some were simply afraid to act without naval backup behind them. In the Bahamas especially, the situation had become close to ungovernable. The formal colonial administration had essentially collapsed. There was no effective governor sitting in Nassau. There was no naval patrol operating in the harbor. New Providence Island had become an unregulated port town in a deep administrative vacuum, where former privateers controlled the waterfront, and the distinction between legal and illegal commerce had ceased to exist in any practical sense. The records suggest the transition from privateering to piracy happened at different speeds for different men. Some tried legitimate alternatives and lasted a few months before the money ran out. Some barely tried at all. A few key figures from this period have clear enough surviving documentation to show how the transition actually worked in individual cases. Benjamin Hornigold is one of the most instructive. Hornigold had been operating out of Nassau during the war years, and in the period following Utrecht, he began raiding without any valid commission. But there is a detail in the accounts of his early operations that is worth sitting with. Hornigold reportedly refused, at least initially, to attack English ships. He confined his raiding to non-English targets, a targeting choice that suggests he was still operating within a privateer mental framework even after the legal framework had expired entirely. He was doing what a privateer without a commission does, which is the technical definition of piracy. But his choices reflected a man who had not yet fully accepted the shift in his own status. The line had moved. His habits had not. Henry Jennings shows the transition from a different angle. Jennings was a privateer captain based in Jamaica, and his most revealing moment came in 1715, when a Spanish treasure fleet wrecked off the Florida coast and lost an enormous quantity of silver. Spain sent salvage crews to recover what remained. Jennings led a raid on the Spanish salvage camp and took a substantial amount of silver, apparently with some informal awareness from certain Jamaican officials who may have considered the operation defensible. Whether this was privateering or outright piracy depended entirely on which official you were standing in front of and what they were willing to say. Spain considered it criminal. Some Jamaican officials initially looked the other way. When the political calculation shifted, Jennings found himself declared a pirate and relocated to Nassau, not because he had made a single dramatic decision to cross into criminality, but because the legal category had moved around him while he continued doing what had always felt like an extension of legitimate raiding. The figure most consistently associated with this period is Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard. The historical record on Teach before his emergence as an established pirate captain around 1716 and 1717 is genuinely thin. He was almost certainly a privateer during the War of Spanish Succession, likely operating from Jamaica, but the documents that would confirm this with precision have not survived. What is clear from colonial correspondence and Admiralty reports is that when Teach appears prominently in the record, he is already embedded in the Nassau pirate economy, already connected to Hornigold, and already commanding serious firepower. He did not arrive from outside the maritime world and choose piracy as a lifestyle. He came from the same labor pool that Utrecht had destabilized, a pool of men with specific skills, established contacts, and no legal economy left to operate in. Nassau between 1713 and 1718 was something that colonial authorities did not have a clean category for. It was closer to a port town in a deep administrative vacuum than anything resembling a republic. Former privateers ran the waterfront. Stolen cargo moved alongside whatever legitimate commerce survived. The rules were enforced informally by reputation and the proximity of armed men with a shared interest in keeping the port functional. The stolen goods pirate crews brought in had to be converted into cash through informal channels, sold to merchants willing to buy without documentation, to visiting captains who needed provisions and did not ask about origins, to buyers in smaller colonial ports where scrutiny was lower. But the part most people miss is that the black market sustaining Nassau was not built from scratch after Utrecht. It ran on the same commercial relationships and the same human networks that had been built during years of legitimate prize trading. Utrecht had removed the official cover from those relationships. It had not removed the relationships themselves. The merchants who had spent years buying legally condemned prize cargo through the court system already knew what captured goods were worth and already had working relationships with port officials prepared to be flexible in exchange for something useful. The infrastructure for the illegal economy was a direct inheritance from the legal one. The government had built it during the war and watched it continue operating without the legal cover the moment the war ended. Would you have voted to keep a captain who had lost 3 engagements in a row, but was still the only man on the ship who could navigate the reefs between Nassau and the Carolina coast at night? That is the kind of decision real pirate crews faced regularly. Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done. Pirate crews operating out of Nassau did use written articles that gave ordinary sailors rights and protections that the Royal Navy and merchant shipping did not routinely offer. This is not a myth. Surviving pirate articles from the period are real documented agreements with specific provisions. They defined shares. They specified injury compensation with graduated amounts based on which limb or sense was lost in action. They gave the quartermaster independent authority over the distribution of plunder, specifically to prevent the captain from adjusting the count in his own favor. Some articles gave the crew a vote on destination and major operational decisions. These are genuine features of how certain pirate crews organized themselves, and they reflect a real effort to solve the trust problem that any group of armed men sharing dangerous work and valuable prizes has to solve somehow. Think of it as a kind of workplace contract, one that gave a working sailor protections that naval service and merchant employment rarely offered. But the same articles that protected a sailor's share also specified punishments for stealing from the common stock, for concealing personal plunder, for abandoning a post during an engagement, and for fighting outside the formally regulated process for resolving disputes. The democratic provisions worked best when prizes were coming in and the crew was healthy. When things went wrong, and in pirate life, things went wrong regularly, the same democratic structure could fracture very quickly. Authority on a pirate vessel was earned through demonstrated competence, shared success, and the ability to manage collective danger. A document alone did not sustain it. The physical reality of life on a pirate vessel was not the freedom festival the legend prefers. Ships were often in poor condition, maintained through improvised repairs because there was no proper dry dock, no official supply of naval stores, and no straightforward way to buy timber, tar, rope, and canvas in quantity without inviting the kind of scrutiny that could end badly. Food was a chronic problem. Water spoiled on longer passages. The tropics killed men through disease at a rate that made battle casualties look minor by comparison. Fevers, dysentery, infected wounds with inadequate care, scurvy on extended voyages without fresh provisions. The list of mundane deadly threats was long, and the available responses were limited. Living in close quarters with armed men who had no external enforcement mechanism and no reliable resupply was a social pressure that the articles and informal democracy could manage in good conditions, and very often could not manage when conditions became genuinely bad. The institutional response to post-Utrecht Atlantic piracy was slow, but eventually significant. By 1717 and 1718, the problem had grown large enough to damage commercial interests in London directly. Insurance rates on Atlantic voyages were climbing. Merchant houses were reporting losses they could not absorb quietly. Colonial governors across multiple jurisdictions were writing to London, describing situations approaching unmanageable. King George I issued a royal proclamation in 1717, offering pardons to pirates who surrendered before a specified deadline. It became known as the Act of Grace, and it is one of the more revealing documents of the entire period. You do not offer mass pardons to born outlaws. You offer them when you need men back inside legality because catching and hanging them all is logistically impossible. The Act of Grace was the British government acknowledging, without explicitly stating it, that the privateer to pirate transition was a structural policy failure. These were men whose legal status had been created and then removed by the same government now offering to restore it, on the condition that they stopped doing what the government had trained and paid them to do during the war. The response to the pardon offer in Nassau split the community sharply. Some men accepted and genuinely tried to return to legitimate maritime work. Some accepted and relapsed within months. Some refused entirely. Benjamin Hornigold accepted and went further than almost anyone expected. He went to work for Woodes Rogers, the new governor brought in to restore colonial order in the Bahamas, actively pursuing former associates doing exactly what he had been doing 18 months earlier. The same man, the same skills, the same knowledge of pirate routes and tactics and contacts, just a different authorization. The behavior had not changed. The commission had. Rogers arrived in Nassau in July of 1718 with a small naval escort, the pardon offer, and a clear mandate to end the informal pirate economy and restore functioning colonial authority. He published the pardon terms to all crews present in the harbor. He accepted surrenders. He organized a local militia, and he made clear that men who refused and continued to operate would be treated as pirates under the law, which meant admiralty trial and, if convicted, hanging. Some crews dispersed before Rogers arrived. Charles Vane refused the pardon openly and left Nassau shooting at Rogers' ships, a theatrical and well-documented exit. The men who stayed and refused had made a choice that was now far more clearly a choice than it had been in 1713. The legal offer was on the table. The enforcement capacity was growing. The comfortable ambiguity of the post-Utrecht years was closing. The admiralty trials that followed are among the most detailed surviving records of Golden Age piracy. What those records show, consistently, is a defendant population drawn almost entirely from maritime backgrounds. Former sailors, former naval men, former privateers, men whose entire working lives had been spent at sea in one capacity or another. The trial of Bartholomew Roberts' crew at Cape Coast Castle in 1722 tried approximately 169 men. Many had been taken into Roberts' crew involuntarily, captured as merchant sailors, and offered the choice of joining or being put out in an open boat. Some had joined voluntarily after months of underpaid merchant service. The court attempted to distinguish between forced men and volunteers, with some effect on sentencing, though not always enough to prevent conviction. More than 50 men were hanged. Bodies were tarred and displayed in gibbet cages at harbor entrances in multiple ports, not as arbitrary cruelty, but as information aimed directly at the maritime labor pool, making the cost of the post-Utrecht calculation visible in the most direct physical terms available. What the gibbet displays could not address was the structural condition that had created the problem. Wars would end again. Commissions would expire again. Sailors would find themselves in the same position as the privateer captain on the deck in 1713. The cycle was not unique to the Utrecht period. The English, French, Dutch, and Spanish maritime world in the century before Utrecht is full of moments where privateering commissions expired, where alliances shifted, and where men operating legally found themselves reclassified as criminals by a change in diplomatic status rather than a change in what they were actually doing. The privateering system was never genuinely stable. It was a government solution to the military problem of needing naval force without the cost of a permanent full navy. A solution that worked well in wartime and created serious and predictable complications every time a peace arrived. Every war that commissioned privateers was building a community of trained maritime raiders with specific economic expectations. Every peace was dropping that community into an economy that could not absorb them, with skills that had no legal market and contacts that connected directly to the informal trade in stolen goods. The Golden Age of Piracy was not a spontaneous outbreak of individual criminality. It was the predictable consequence of a system that the governments of the Atlantic world had been running for over a century without seriously grappling with what happened when it ended. You are back on that deck in 1713. The captain is reading the Utrecht dispatch for the second time. His commission is worthless. His crew is armed and watching him. The prize courts are closed. The Spanish vessels he was hunting last month are now official trading partners of the crown he used to serve. He has a ship, an experienced crew, weapons, a month of provisions, and detailed knowledge of every significant merchant route between the Windward Islands and the Carolina coast. He did not sit down one evening and decide to become a pirate in any dramatic sense. He made a series of smaller, practical decisions, each one driven by immediate need, each one a step further from the legal framework that had expired around him, while his skills remained exactly as useful and as dangerous as they had always been. The system that created him, used him, and paid him had simply stopped protecting him. If Deadman's Shore is where you want to spend time with this kind of history, subscribe and stay close. The next video in this series gets into what happened when stolen cargo had to become clean money, and the economy that made that conversion possible inside colonial ports that were officially committed to preventing it. The Treaty of Utrecht did not create criminals. It created a category crisis. Thousands of men who had been legal one day and illegal the next, whose skills, contacts, ports, routes, and economic networks had all been built under explicit government authorization that was then withdrawn with no plan for what those men were supposed to do afterward. It did not resolve itself quietly. It became the Golden Age of Piracy. The men at the center of it were not, in most cases, born outlaws or romantic rebels choosing freedom over civilization. They were the predictable result of a maritime labor system designed for war, handed to men who needed to survive in peacetime, with no viable exit that did not feel like complete surrender. The difference between a privateer and a pirate was not always a man's character. Sometimes it was just the date on the paperwork.